There was a time many centuries ago when the center of the Roman world began, slowly and without much fanfare, to shift toward the east. This is where our story begins tonight. Not with a battle, not with a sudden collapse, but with a quiet turning, the kind of change that takes decades to notice, the kind that unfolds the way a river gradually finds a new course across a wide and patient landscape. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire had grown so vast that it had become difficult for any single person to govern from one place. The western provinces, stretching toward Britain and Gaul and Spain, felt increasingly distant from the eastern provinces, which reached toward Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. Trade routes, tax revenues, and the movement of grain ships all told the same story. The wealth of the empire and much of its population had settled comfortably into the eastern Mediterranean. It was into this slowly shifting world that a man named Constantine rose to power. He had spent years securing his position through a long series of alliances and campaigns, and by the year 324, he stood as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Constantine looked at a map of his territories and considered carefully and without haste where the true heart of his empire ought to be. His gaze settled on a small, unassuming city called Byzantium. It sat on a peninsula where the waters of the Bosphorus meet the Sea of Marmara, a place where Europe and Asia are separated by little more than a narrow channel that a person could cross by boat in less than an hour. Byzantium had existed for nearly 1,000 years already by the time Constantine noticed it, founded by Greek settlers who had recognized long before him that this particular spot held a quiet kind of promise. The location offered natural harbors on 3 sides, protected inlets where ships could rest safely even during rough weather. It commanded the narrow straits that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, meaning that anyone who controlled this city could, in principle, oversee much of the trade moving between 2 great bodies of water, and it sat at the meeting point of 2 continents, allowing armies, merchants, and travelers to pass between Europe and Asia without needing to sail around vast stretches of coastline. Constantine decided to rebuild this modest city into something far grander, a new capital worthy of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the deserts of Syria. Construction began in the year 324 and continued for 6 years, during which laborers, engineers, and architects worked to expand the old Greek settlement into a city of imperial scale. New walls were raised, encircling a much larger area than Byzantium had ever occupied before. Grand forums were laid out, wide enough for processions and public gatherings. A hippodrome was constructed for chariot races, an entertainment that Romans everywhere had long enjoyed. And this particular hippodrome would become one of the largest in the ancient world. The city was dedicated in the year 330, and it took on a new name to honor its founder. It became known as Constantinople, the city of Constantine, though many of its residents and its administrators would continue, for centuries, to think of themselves simply as Romans living in the Roman Empire's newest and most favored city. It is worth pausing here, in this early moment of the story, to consider what kind of place Constantine was building. He was not simply constructing a military stronghold or a trading post. He envisioned a city that would rival Rome itself in prestige. A city with its own senate, its own grain distributions for citizens, and its own collection of monuments drawn from across the empire. Statues and works of art were brought from Greece, from Asia Minor, from Egypt, gathered together to decorate the public spaces of this new capital, so that a visitor walking through its forums might see, in a single afternoon, artifacts spanning centuries of history from many different corners of the ancient world. Constantine was also a Christian, or at least the first Roman emperor to formally favor Christianity, having issued the Edict of Milan some years earlier alongside his co-emperor Licinius, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. This decision would shape the character of Constantinople from its very founding. Unlike Rome, which carried centuries of pagan temples and traditions woven into its streets and public life, Constantinople was built as a city with Christian churches at its heart from the beginning. This gave the new capital a different feeling, a sense of belonging to a new chapter of Roman history, rather than simply continuing the old one. The years that followed Constantine's death in 337 were not without difficulty. His sons divided the empire among themselves, and disputes over succession and religious doctrine continued to unfold across the following decades. Yet, Constantinople itself continued to grow. Its population expanded steadily, drawn by opportunities in trade, administration, and the simple appeal of living in a city favored by emperors. Aqueducts were built to bring fresh water from the surrounding countryside. Granaries were constructed along the shoreline to store the wheat that arrived by ship from Egypt, a vital lifeline that would feed the city's population for centuries to come. By the later 4th century, under emperors who followed Constantine, the city continued to take shape. A new and much larger set of walls was planned, one that would eventually be built under the Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century. Walls so formidable that they would protect the city from invasion for roughly 1,000 years. A span of time that is worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because very few defensive structures in human history have proven so enduring. It is easy, when thinking about the ancient world, to imagine history moving in dramatic leaps, one great event following another in quick succession. But the founding of Constantinople was not like that at all. It was the product of careful geographic reasoning, decades of construction, and a slow accumulation of political and religious changes that would only reveal their full significance many generations later. The city grew the way a garden grows, tended patiently, season after season, its final shape not fully visible to those who planted the first seeds. As we move through this history together across the segments ahead, we will follow the story of this city and the empire that grew around it. An empire that its own citizens never called Byzantine at all. They called themselves Romans, right up until the very end. The term Byzantine was applied by historians centuries later, a convenient label for a state that modern scholars found difficult to categorize, caught as it seemed to be between the ancient Roman world and the medieval one that followed. For now, it is enough to picture the city as it stood in the closing years of the 4th century. Ships moving quietly across the calm waters of the Golden Horn, merchants unloading goods from Egypt and the Black Sea coast, new churches rising alongside grand civic buildings, and a population that considered itself heir to Rome's ancient authority, while living somewhere entirely new. The sun would have set slowly over the water each evening, the light softening across rooftops and domes. The city settling into the quiet rhythms of a place still finding its permanent shape. In the segment that follows, we will look more closely at the physical landscape of Constantinople itself, its walls, its harbors, and the geography that made it, for so long, one of the most defensible and prosperous cities in the world. Let us settle now into the physical geography of Constantinople itself, because the shape of the land and the water around it explains a great deal about why this city endured for so many centuries, while so many others across the ancient and medieval world eventually fell. The city sat upon a peninsula roughly triangular in shape, bordered on one side by the Sea of Marmara, and on another by a long, narrow inlet known as the Golden Horn. This inlet curved gently into the land, forming a natural harbor so calm and so well protected that ships could anchor there safely through almost any storm. A great chain could be stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn in times of danger, drawn taut between towers on either shore, blocking enemy ships from entering the harbor at all. This simple mechanism, a heavy iron chain resting just beneath the surface of the water, protected the city's fleet and its shoreline markets for generation after generation. On the third side of the peninsula, facing inland toward Europe, lay the greatest feat of defensive engineering the ancient and medieval world had ever produced. These were the Theodosian walls, begun under the Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century, and completed around the year 413. They were not a single wall, but a system of 3, layered one behind another, each rising higher than the last as an attacker moved inward. The outermost was a moat, wide, and typically kept full of water, that any approaching army would need to cross before reaching solid ground. Beyond the moat stood a low outer wall, and beyond that, set back on higher ground, rose the massive inner wall, reaching heights of perhaps 12 meters, and reinforced with towers spaced at regular intervals along its entire length. This layered design meant that even if an attacking force managed to cross the moat and overcome the outer wall, they would find themselves trapped in a narrow killing ground beneath the looming inner wall, exposed to defenders positioned safely above. It was a design born of careful thought rather than urgency, refined and strengthened over the centuries as engineering knowledge advanced, and as new threats emerged from different directions. The walls stretched for nearly 6.5 kilometers across the base of the peninsula, from the shore of the Golden Horn to the shore of the Sea of Marmara, sealing the city off entirely from the surrounding countryside. For roughly 1,000 years, these walls would turn back invading armies again and again, including forces far larger and better equipped than the defenders inside. It is worth noting, calmly and without exaggeration, that very few defensive structures anywhere in human history have matched this record of endurance. Water, too, played its part in the city's protection. The currents running through the Bosphorus and around the peninsula were often strong and unpredictable, complicating naval assaults for any fleet unfamiliar with local conditions. Constantinopolitan sailors, who spent their entire lives navigating these waters, held a natural advantage over foreign fleets attempting to approach from unfamiliar angles. Beyond defense, this geography shaped the daily rhythm of life within the city. The Golden Horn functioned as the commercial heart of Constantinople, its shoreline lined with docks, warehouses, and markets where goods from across the known world were bought and sold. Grain ships arrived from Egypt and later from other provinces, their cargo destined for the public granaries that fed the population through a system of subsidized bread distribution, not unlike the grain doles that had sustained the population of Rome itself in earlier centuries. Silk arrived along overland routes from the east, eventually giving rise to a local silk industry once the secrets of sericulture reached the Mediterranean during the reign of Justinian. Spices, timber, furs, and enslaved people moved through the city's markets as well, connecting Constantinople to trade networks stretching from Scandinavia to China. The city itself was built across 7 hills, echoing the 7 hills of Rome, a deliberate architectural and symbolic choice that reinforced Constantinople's claim to be the natural successor to the old capital. Between these hills ran wide avenues, the most famous of which was the Mise, a grand processional street lined with columns and porticos that ran from the great palace near the tip of the peninsula out toward the land walls. Along this street stood forums, marketplaces, and monuments, and it was here that emperors staged their triumphal processions, moving slowly through crowds of citizens who had gathered to watch. At the heart of the city stood the great palace complex, a sprawling collection of buildings, gardens, and courtyards that served as the residence of the emperor and the administrative center of the entire empire. Nearby stood the hippodrome, a massive arena capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators, where chariot races were held regularly, and where much of the city's social and political energy found its outlet. The factions who supported different chariot teams, known by their colors, blue and green among them, held genuine political significance, and their rivalries occasionally spilled beyond the racetrack into broader civic life. Fresh water presented an ongoing challenge for a city of this size, since the peninsula itself had limited natural springs. Engineers responded by constructing an extensive system of aqueducts, some stretching many kilometers into the surrounding countryside of Thrace, channeling water toward the city where it was stored in a network of underground cisterns. Some of these cisterns were modest and practical, while others were built on a grand scale, vast underground chambers supported by rows of columns, their ceilings arching overhead in the cool darkness, holding enough water to sustain the city through droughts or during sieges when outside supplies might be cut off entirely. Taken together, these elements, the natural harbor of the Golden Horn, the formidable Theodosian walls, the wide processional avenues, the grand cisterns holding water in reserve, formed a city that was as much a work of careful planning as it was a product of fortunate geography. It was a place built to endure, and endure it did, weathering earthquakes, sieges, fires, and centuries of political upheaval while remaining, for most of that time, one of the wealthiest and most populous cities in the entire world. As the sun set over the Golden Horn each evening, the water would have taken on a soft golden hue, the origin, some believe, of the inlet's name. Fishing boats returning from the day's work would glide quietly past merchant vessels at anchor, while lamplight began to flicker in windows across the hillside neighborhoods rising above the harbor. It was, by most accounts from travelers of the time, a strikingly beautiful city, and one that inspired a kind of quiet awe in visitors arriving from less developed corners of Europe and Asia. In our next segment, we will turn to the reign of Justinian and Theodora, a period in which this city and its empire reached a level of ambition and reach that few could have imagined in the centuries before. In the year 527, a man named Justinian became emperor of the Roman world, governed from Constantinople, and his reign would come to represent one of the most ambitious periods in the empire's long history. Justinian had risen through the ranks of imperial service under his uncle, the Emperor Justin, and by the time the throne passed to him, he had already spent years absorbing the details of law, administration, and imperial governance. Beside him stood his wife, Theodora, whose own path to the palace had been remarkable in its own right. She had come from humble origins, the daughter of a bear keeper associated with the hippodrome, and had worked in various capacities within the entertainment circles of the city before her life intersected with Justinian's. Their marriage required a change in Roman law, since existing statutes forbade senators from marrying women of her former profession, and Justinian, even before becoming emperor, arranged for that law to be altered. Once she became empress, Theodora proved to be an active and influential partner in governance, involved in matters of law, diplomacy, and religious policy throughout her husband's reign. One of the defining moments of their partnership came early, in the year 532, during what became known as the Nika riots. The chariot racing factions of the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, had grown increasingly restless over taxation and judicial decisions, and their discontent erupted into widespread rioting that threatened to overthrow Justinian entirely. Much of the city center burned during the unrest, and for a time it seemed as though Justinian might flee the city to preserve his life. It was Theodora, according to the historical accounts that survive, who counseled him to remain and face the crisis directly, reportedly stating that the imperial purple made a fine burial shroud, meaning that she preferred death as empress to a humiliating escape. Justinian's forces ultimately suppressed the riot, and though the human cost was significant, the event marked a turning point that allowed Justinian to consolidate his authority and begin the ambitious projects that would define his reign. Among these projects, one of the most enduring was legal rather than architectural. Justinian commissioned a systematic review and codification of Roman law, a task carried out by a team of jurists led by a man named Tribonian. The result was a collection of legal texts that came to be known collectively as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This compilation organized centuries of scattered and sometimes contradictory Roman legal rulings into a coherent, structured system, and it would go on to influence legal traditions across Europe for well over 1,000 years afterward, forming a foundation that many modern legal systems can trace their lineage back to, even today. Justinian also pursued an ambitious program of military reconquest, aiming to restore the western territories of the old Roman Empire that had fallen under the control of various Germanic kingdoms during the previous century. He dispatched his general Belisarius, one of the most capable military commanders of the age, first to North Africa, where the Vandal kingdom was defeated with surprising speed, and then to Italy, where a long and difficult campaign unfolded against the Ostrogothic kingdom that had ruled there since the fall of the Western Empire. These campaigns, stretched across many years and considerable expense, succeeded in bringing North Africa, much of Italy, and portions of southern Spain back under the authority of Constantinople, extending Roman rule around the Mediterranean basin in a way that would not be repeated again in the centuries that followed. Alongside law and conquest, Justinian's reign is remembered for an extraordinary building program throughout the empire, and nowhere more so than in Constantinople itself. Following the destruction of the Nika riots, which had damaged the old Hagia Sophia church, along with much of the city center, Justinian commissioned a new and far grander structure to replace it. Two architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, were tasked with designing a building unlike anything that had come before, and construction moved forward with remarkable speed, completed in less than 6 years, a pace that reflected both the resources of the empire and the priority Justinian placed on the project. The result was the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, crowned by an enormous central dome that seemed, to those standing beneath it, to float weightlessly above the vast interior space, supported by a ring of windows that allowed light to pour in around its base. Contemporary accounts describe visitors standing beneath that dome in a kind of hushed wonder, and the building would go on to serve as the primary cathedral of the empire for roughly 900 years, later becoming a mosque, and today functioning again as a mosque following changes to its status in more recent history. Its dome, its scale, and its careful use of light-influenced architecture across the region for centuries afterward. Justinian's reign was not without hardship for the empire's population. In the year 541, a devastating outbreak of plague arrived in Constantinople, likely spreading along trade routes from Egypt, and it would recur in waves for decades afterward. This pandemic, now generally referred to by historians as the Plague of Justinian, caused significant loss of life across the empire and placed considerable strain on the population, the economy, and the military campaigns that were still underway. Modern historians continue to study and debate the precise scale of mortality caused by this outbreak, though there is broad agreement that its impact on the empire's population and resources was substantial. By the time Justinian died in the year 565, he had reshaped the empire in lasting ways, through law, through architecture, and through a temporary but significant expansion of its territorial reach. Yet the costs of his ambitions, the long wars in Italy, the burden of taxation needed to fund them, and the demographic toll of repeated plague outbreaks left his successors with considerable challenges to manage in the decades that followed. It is worth sitting quietly with the image of Constantinople during these years, a city where legal scholars worked through ancient texts by lamplight, where craftsmen labored on mosaics destined for the walls of new churches, and where, above it all, the great dome of Hagia Sophia rose against the sky, a physical expression of an empire that still saw itself as the direct continuation of ancient Rome, even as the world around it continued to change. In our next segment, we will look at how this empire responded to new pressures arriving from the east, as Persian armies, and eventually the forces of a new religion emerging from Arabia began to reshape the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the decades following Justinian's death, the empire that he had worked so hard to expand began to face a very different set of challenges, arriving primarily from the east. To understand this period, it helps to picture the broader map of the 7th century, a world in which two great powers, the Roman Empire governed from Constantinople, and the Sasanian Persian Empire centered in what is now Iran and Iraq, had spent centuries locked in a long and recurring rivalry along their shared borders in Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus. This rivalry reached a particularly intense peak in the early 7th century, during the reign of the Emperor Heraclius, who took power in the year 610. At the time of his accession, the empire found itself in a genuinely difficult position. Persian forces under the Sasanian king Khosrow II had made significant advances into Roman territory, eventually capturing the cities of Antioch, Damascus, and Jerusalem. And by the year 626, Persian and allied Avar forces had even brought a joint siege against Constantinople itself. Though the city's formidable walls, together with the strength of its navy on the waters surrounding it, held firm against the attack, Heraclius responded not with a defensive posture, but with a long and carefully planned counteroffensive, leading his forces deep into Persian territory over a series of campaigns stretching across several years. This culminated in a decisive Roman victory near the ruins of ancient Nineveh in the year 627, which so destabilized the Persian court that Khosrow was overthrown shortly afterward. The subsequent peace settlement restored the territories that Persia had taken, and in the year 630, Heraclius personally returned a relic believed to be a fragment of the true cross to Jerusalem, an act that was received across the Christian world as a symbolic restoration of order after decades of conflict and loss. Yet this hard-won peace proved remarkably brief, even as Heraclius was restoring Roman authority in the east. A new set of developments was quietly unfolding in the Arabian Peninsula, a region that had, for centuries, remained largely outside the direct concerns of both the Roman and Persian empires. Following the death of the prophet Muhammad in the year 632, the newly unified Arab tribes, now bound together under the growing framework of Islam, began a series of remarkable military expansions that would, within a single generation, reshape the map of the entire region. Arab forces moved first into Syria and Palestine, provinces that Rome had only recently reclaimed from Persia after such difficult effort. The Roman army suffered a significant defeat at the Battle of Yarmouk in the year 636, a loss that opened the way for Arab forces to take control of the Levant. From there, the expansion continued into Egypt, a province of enormous importance to the empire both for its grain supplies and its tax revenue, which fell under Arab control by the year 642. Persia, already weakened from its long war with Rome, fell even more completely as the Sasanian Empire itself was conquered entirely within a few decades, bringing an end to a Persian imperial tradition that stretched back many centuries. For the Roman Empire governed from Constantinople, the loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt within such a short span of years represented an extraordinary contraction. These provinces had, for centuries, provided much of the empire's wealth, its grain, and a significant portion of its population. What remained afterward was a smaller and more geographically compact state, centered primarily on Anatolia, parts of the Balkans, and the city of Constantinople itself, along with scattered holdings in Italy and elsewhere that would prove increasingly difficult to defend and administer from such a distance. This contraction brought about significant internal changes as well. The empire reorganized its remaining territories into a new administrative system known as the theme system, in which military and civil authority in a given region were combined under a single military commander called a strategos. This arrangement allowed for a more rapid and flexible response to the ongoing raids and incursions that continued along the empire's new, much closer frontiers, since Arab forces would, in the decades that followed, launch repeated campaigns into Anatolia itself, and even mount further sieges against Constantinople. One such siege, occurring between 674 and 678, tested the city's defenses over a remarkably long period. And it was during confrontations of this era that the Roman navy made effective use of a weapon that has since become one of the most discussed innovations of the period: an incendiary substance known as Greek fire. The exact composition of Greek fire remains uncertain even to modern historians, since the formula was a closely guarded state secret. But it appears to have been a liquid that could be projected from tubes mounted on ships, capable of continuing to burn even on the surface of water, which made it particularly effective in naval engagements. Its use, along with the strength of the Theodosian walls, allowed Constantinople to withstand this and later sieges that might otherwise have ended the empire entirely. A second major siege took place between 717 and 718 during the reign of the Emperor Leo III, and once again the combination of the city's defenses, its naval technology, and difficult conditions faced by the besieging force resulted in the attackers eventually withdrawing. This siege is often regarded by historians as one of the more significant turning points of the period, since a successful conquest of Constantinople at this time might have opened the way for further expansion into southeastern Europe. By the middle of the 8th century, the immediate territorial crisis had stabilized, though the empire remained considerably smaller than it had been under Justinian 2 centuries earlier. It had, in a sense, been reshaped by these pressures into a more defensively organized, more militarized state. One whose center of gravity had shifted more firmly toward Anatolia and the Balkans, with Constantinople itself standing as the resilient anchor point around which the rest of the state continued to organize itself. It is worth pausing here to notice the pattern that emerges across these decades, a pattern that will recur throughout the empire's long history. Each time significant territory was lost, the state that remained proved capable of reorganizing itself, adapting its administration, and continuing forward in a different, often more compact form. This resilience, quiet and unglamorous as it may have been, allowed the empire centered on Constantinople to persist for centuries, longer than many of its neighbors and rivals. In the segment that follows, we will turn inward, away from questions of warfare and territory, to look at a controversy that unfolded within the empire's own religious and cultural life during this same general period. A dispute concerning the use of religious images that came to be known as iconoclasm within the life of the empire, alongside the military pressures we have just described. There unfolded a quieter but deeply consequential dispute concerning the role of religious images within Christian worship. This controversy, which modern historians refer to as iconoclasm, occupied much of the 8th and 9th centuries, and it reveals a great deal about how the empire understood the relationship between religious devotion, imperial authority, and artistic tradition. By the early 8th century, the use of icons, painted images depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various saints, had become deeply embedded in the religious practice of ordinary people throughout the empire. These images were displayed in churches and homes alike, and many believers had come to treat them with great reverence, offering prayers before them, and in some cases, attributing miraculous properties to particular icons that were said to have healed the sick or protected cities from disaster. In the year 726, the Emperor Leo III began to move against this practice, apparently influenced by a combination of theological concerns, and, according to some historical accounts, by a desire to address what he interpreted as a period of divine displeasure, possibly connected to volcanic activity in the Aegean or to recent military setbacks. Leo argued that the veneration of icons risked crossing into idolatry, a violation of the biblical commandment against the worship of graven images, and he began to restrict the display and veneration of such images across the empire. His son and successor, Constantine V, pursued this policy with considerably more intensity, convening a church council in the year 754 that formally condemned the veneration of icons and led to a period of active removal and destruction of religious images from churches throughout the empire. This policy did not proceed without resistance. Many members of the clergy, particularly monks living in monastic communities, continued to defend the use of icons, arguing that images of Christ and the saints served an important devotional and educational purpose, allowing ordinary believers, many of whom could not read theological texts, to connect with the sacred through visual representation. Some of the most articulate defenses of icon veneration during this period came from theologians living outside direct imperial control, most notably John of Damascus, who wrote extensively in defense of icons from within territory that had, by this time, come under the rule of the Arab Caliphate, a position that allowed him a degree of safety from imperial reprisal that clergy living within the empire itself did not always enjoy. The controversy continued for decades, its intensity rising and falling depending on the priorities of whichever emperor held the throne. A temporary restoration of icon veneration occurred under the Empress Irene, who convened the Second Council of Nicaea in the year 787, which reversed the earlier condemnation and permitted the veneration of icons once again, framing this practice as honoring the person depicted rather than worshiping the physical image itself, a theological distinction that would remain central to Orthodox Christian understanding of icons in the centuries that followed. This restoration, however, did not mark a permanent end to the dispute. A second period of iconoclasm emerged in the early 9th century, beginning under the Emperor Leo V in 815, and continuing intermittently until the year 843, when the regent Empress Theodora, acting on behalf of her young son Michael III, oversaw a final and lasting restoration of icon veneration. This event is still commemorated within Orthodox Christianity today as the triumph of orthodoxy, observed annually on the first Sunday of Great Lent. A quiet reminder of how significant this centuries-old dispute remained within the religious memory of the empire and its successors. It is worth considering, calmly and without judgment toward either side of this dispute, what this controversy reveals about the empire during this period. It was not simply a debate about art or aesthetics. It touched on fundamental questions about how the divine could or could not be represented, about the proper boundaries of imperial authority over religious practice, and about the role that monasteries, as centers of both spiritual and, at times, political influence, played within the broader life of the state. Emperors on both sides of the debate found reasons connected to political stability, military fortune, and theological conviction to support their positions. And the ordinary population, meanwhile, experienced these shifts as changes in the physical appearance of their own local churches. Images appearing and disappearing from the walls they had known their entire lives. The controversy also had lasting artistic consequences. During periods when iconoclasm held sway, many older icons and religious mosaics were removed or painted over, and the production of new figural religious art was significantly curtailed, replaced in some churches with simpler decorative patterns, such as crosses or geometric and plant-based motifs that avoided depicting human figures altogether. Following the final restoration of icons in 843, however, a renewed and, in many respects, more refined tradition of religious art began to flourish. One that would go on to produce some of the most celebrated mosaics and icon paintings of the entire medieval period. Work that continues to be studied and admired by art historians today. By the middle of the 9th century, with the iconoclast controversy finally settled, the empire entered a period of relative internal religious stability that would allow it to focus its energies elsewhere, on administration, on culture, and on a gradual recovery of influence in regions it had lost or neglected during the difficult centuries before. This stability would help set the stage for what many historians consider one of the empire's most accomplished periods, a stretch of time associated with the rise of a new imperial dynasty. In our next segment, we will look at this period of recovery and cultural flourishing, often associated with the Macedonian dynasty, during which the empire's scholars, artists, and rulers worked to consolidate and refine the traditions they had inherited from centuries past. With the religious controversies of iconoclasm settled by the middle of the 9th century, the empire entered a period that many historians consider among its most successful, a stretch of roughly 200 years associated primarily with a line of rulers known as the Macedonian dynasty. This dynasty took its name, somewhat by coincidence, from the region of Macedonia in the Balkans, the birthplace of its founder, a man named Basil, who rose from relatively humble origins to eventually claim the imperial throne in the year 867. Basil's rise to power involved a path that included time spent in the imperial household, and eventually a close relationship with the reigning Emperor Michael III, whom he ultimately succeeded, though the precise details of that succession involved considerable court intrigue that need not detain us here. What matters more for our purposes is what followed, a period during which Basil and his successors worked to stabilize the empire's finances, reform its legal system, and gradually reclaim territory and influence that had been lost or diminished during the difficult centuries before. Under Basil and his son Leo VI, who reigned through the early 10th century, the empire undertook a significant legal project, revising and updating the old Justinianic law codes to better reflect the practical needs of the state as it existed at that time. Leo also earned a reputation as a scholar in his own right, and it was during this general period that Constantinople experienced a broader revival of interest in classical learning, with scholars working to preserve, copy, and study texts from ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature. A quiet but significant undertaking that helped ensure many works of antiquity survived into later centuries, eventually influencing the wider intellectual world well beyond the empire's own borders. Military fortunes during this period gradually improved as well, particularly during the reign of Basil II, who came to the throne as a young man in 976 and would go on to rule for nearly 50 years, one of the longest reigns in the empire's history. Basil II is remembered above all for his long campaigns against the Bulgarian Empire to the north, a rival power that had grown considerably in strength and had, at various points, posed a serious threat to Constantinople itself. Over the course of several decades, Basil methodically campaigned against Bulgarian territory, and by the year 1018, the Bulgarian state had been fully incorporated into the Roman Empire, a considerable territorial achievement that extended Constantinople's authority across most of the Balkan Peninsula. This period is often described by historians as a kind of golden autumn for the empire, evoking the image of a mature harvest gathered after a long and sometimes difficult growing season. Constantinople itself flourished as a center of trade, connecting merchants from Scandinavia and Russia in the north to the Islamic world in the south and east. Foreign merchants, diplomats, and travelers regularly visited the city, and many left written accounts describing its wealth, its markets, and the elaborate ceremonial life of the imperial court, which had, by this time, developed an intricate system of protocol, dress, and ritual designed to project an image of order, permanence, and divine favor to all who witnessed it. Diplomacy, alongside military strength, played an important role in the empire's approach to its neighbors during this period. Constantinople frequently relied on a combination of strategic marriages, financial subsidies, religious missionary work, and careful management of trade relationships to maintain influence over surrounding peoples without always resorting to direct military conflict. One of the most significant outcomes of this diplomatic approach was the gradual Christianization of the Kievan Rus, the medieval state centered in what is now Ukraine and Western Russia, a process that culminated in the conversion of the Rus ruler Vladimir the Great around the year 988, an event closely tied to his marriage to a Byzantine princess named Anna, the sister of the reigning Emperor Basil II. This connection brought Orthodox Christianity, along with elements of Byzantine art, architecture, and administrative practice, into the cultural life of the Rus lands, an influence whose effects would extend across Eastern Europe for centuries to come. Artistic and architectural achievement flourished during this period as well, building upon the renewed tradition of religious imagery that had emerged following the resolution of the Iconoclast controversy. Churches throughout the empire were decorated with intricate mosaics depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various saints, rendered in the careful, formalized style that has come to be closely associated with Byzantine religious art, a style characterized by its use of gold backgrounds, its elongated and dignified figures, and its careful attention to symbolic detail rather than naturalistic representation. Manuscripts produced during this period, often illuminated with careful illustrations, preserved not only religious texts, but also historical chronicles, scientific treatises, and works of classical literature, reflecting the broader intellectual revival taking place within monastery libraries and scholarly circles across the empire. It would be inaccurate to describe this period as one entirely free of difficulty. Succession disputes, occasional military setbacks, and administrative challenges continued to occur throughout these 2 centuries, as they had in every period of the empire's history before. Yet taken as a whole, the era of the Macedonian dynasty represents a period during which Constantinople reasserted itself as one of the wealthiest, most culturally accomplished, and most diplomatically influential states in the medieval world. Its authority respected from Western Europe to the Islamic caliphates of the Middle East. By the time Basil II died in 1025, having spent much of his life on campaign, and having significantly expanded the empire's territory and influence, the state he left behind stood, by most measures, at one of the high points of its long history. Yet, as we will see in the segment that follows, the decades after his death would bring new challenges, some arising from within the empire's own court politics, and others arriving once again from beyond its borders, that would gradually test the stability this golden period had achieved. Following the death of Basil II in 1025, the empire entered a period during which the strong, centralized leadership of the previous decades gave way to a somewhat less stable stretch of governance. And it is worth spending some time here, calmly and carefully, considering how this shift unfolded. Basil II had never married, and his immediate successors were drawn from a narrower and, in some respects, less experienced pool of candidates than the empire had enjoyed under his long personal rule. Various relatives, court officials, and military figures moved in and out of power over the following decades. And while the empire's underlying institutions, its bureaucracy, its legal system, and its provincial administration continued to function, the quality and consistency of leadership at the very top varied considerably from one reign to the next. At the same time, new external pressures began to emerge along 2 very different frontiers. In the east, a new power was rising among Turkic peoples who had, over the preceding century, migrated westward from Central Asia and gradually adopted Islam, eventually coalescing into what became known as the Seljuk Turkish state. Seljuk forces began raiding into the empire's eastern Anatolian provinces with increasing frequency during the middle decades of the 11th century, testing the strength of a frontier that had, for generations, remained relatively stable. This pressure culminated in the year 1071 at a battle near the town of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, where the Roman army, led personally by the Emperor Romanos IV, met Seljuk forces under their leader Alp Arslan. The battle ended in a defeat for the Roman army, and Romanos himself was captured, though he was, notably, treated with considerable respect and eventually released under a negotiated peace agreement. The battle itself, while significant, was perhaps less immediately catastrophic than its long-term consequences, because the political instability that followed within Constantinople, as various factions contested the throne in Romanos' absence, and after his return, prevented the empire from mounting an effective response to secure its eastern frontier. In the years that followed, Turkish groups moved gradually into the Anatolian plateau, settling there in ways that would permanently reshape the demographic and political character of a region that had, for centuries, formed one of the empire's most important sources of manpower, agriculture, and tax revenue. Meanwhile, in the West, the empire faced a different kind of challenge from Norman adventurers who had established themselves in southern Italy over the course of the 11th century, gradually displacing the last remaining Byzantine territories on the Italian peninsula, territories that had endured, in some form, since the days of Justinian's reconquest 5 centuries earlier. By the 1070s, these last Italian holdings had been lost as well, closing a long chapter of Byzantine presence in the Western Mediterranean. It was against this backdrop of territorial contraction and internal political turbulence that a new emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, came to power in 1081, founding what would become known as the Komnenian Dynasty. Alexios inherited an empire under considerable strain, its treasury depleted, its Anatolian heartland increasingly under Turkish control, and its western territories in Italy already lost. He proved to be a capable and pragmatic ruler, working over the following decades to stabilize the empire's finances, reform its military recruitment and land grant systems, and rebuild a functional army capable of defending what remained of the state's core territories. One of the more significant developments of Alexios's reign involved his outreach to Western Europe for military assistance against the Seljuk Turks. In 1095, following an appeal from Alexios to Pope Urban II for mercenary support, the Pope instead called for a much larger mobilization of Western European knights and nobles, an appeal that developed into what came to be known as the First Crusade. This was, in some respects, not entirely what Alexios had originally envisioned. since he had anticipated organized companies of soldiers under his own command, rather than a large, independently organized movement with its own religious and territorial ambitions. Nonetheless, the arrival of Crusader armies in 1096 and 1097 did provide meaningful military assistance, and in cooperation with Byzantine forces, these combined armies succeeded in recapturing the important city of Nicaea from the Seljuks and helped facilitate Byzantine recovery of significant portions of western and coastal Anatolia over the following years. The relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader forces moving through its territory, however, proved complicated from the very beginning, marked by mutual suspicion alongside genuine cooperation. Byzantine officials viewed the Crusaders as useful but potentially unpredictable allies, unfamiliar with the diplomatic customs of the region and prone to establishing their own independent territories, such as the Crusader states later founded in Antioch, Edessa, and Jerusalem. Rather than returning conquered territory to Byzantine control, as Alexios had hoped, Crusader leaders, for their part, sometimes viewed Byzantine caution and diplomatic maneuvering with suspicion, feeling that their Greek allies were not always forthcoming with the military and material support they expected. Despite these tensions, the reign of Alexios and his immediate successors, his son John II and grandson Manuel I, represented a genuine period of recovery for the empire, often referred to by historians as the Komnenian Restoration. Byzantine forces reclaimed substantial territory in western Anatolia. The empire's finances stabilized considerably, and Constantinople itself continued to serve as one of the great commercial and cultural centers of the medieval world, hosting merchants, scholars, and diplomats from across Europe and the Islamic world alike. Manuel I, who reigned through much of the 12th century, pursued an active and ambitious foreign policy, engaging diplomatically and militarily with Crusader states in the Levant, with the Norman kingdom in Sicily, and with various powers across the Balkans and Italy. His reign represented, in many respects, the final sustained period of Byzantine strength on the international stage, a time during which the empire, though smaller than it had been under Justinian or Basil II, remained a formidable and respected power in its own right. Yet this recovery, like the golden period before it, would not prove permanent. In the segment that follows, we will look at how relations between the Byzantine Empire and its Western European neighbors, complicated for so long by both cooperation and suspicion, eventually gave way to one of the most significant and sorrowful events in the empire's long history. By the closing years of the 12th century, relations between the Byzantine Empire and the various powers of Western Europe had grown increasingly strained, shaped by decades of complicated interaction during the crusading period. by commercial rivalries with Italian maritime republics such as Venice and Genoa, and by lingering religious differences between the Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople, and the Catholic Church, centered in Rome, differences that had formally solidified into a lasting schism in the year 1054, though the practical effects of that schism had developed gradually over the generations that followed rather than arriving as a single, sudden rupture. It was within this atmosphere of mutual suspicion that one of the most significant, and for the empire, most sorrowful events of its long history unfolded. In the year 1202, a new crusading expedition was organized in Western Europe, intended originally to sail toward Egypt as a staging point for the recovery of Jerusalem. This expedition, which came to be known as the Fourth Crusade, required substantial funding to secure the ships and provisions necessary for such a large undertaking. And the Crusader leadership arranged much of this financing through an agreement with the Republic of Venice. When the Crusader forces proved unable to raise the full sum promised to Venice, a series of complicated political arrangements led the expedition toward Constantinople rather than Egypt, initially under the pretext of restoring a deposed Byzantine claimant named Alexios Angelos to the throne, in exchange for promises of substantial financial payment and military support for the broader crusading effort. The Crusader fleet arrived outside Constantinople in the summer of 1203, and after a period of conflict and negotiation, the deposed claimant's father was restored to the throne alongside his son, an arrangement that proved unstable almost immediately, as the new rulers struggled to gather the funds they had promised to their Crusader allies, and popular sentiment within Constantinople turned firmly against a settlement that many residents viewed as a humiliating foreign imposition. By early 1204, this arrangement had collapsed entirely amid internal Byzantine political upheaval, and the Crusader forces, along with their Venetian allies, made the fateful decision to attack and take the city for themselves, rather than continue negotiating with an increasingly unstable Byzantine government. In April of 1204, Constantinople fell to the Crusader army, an event that marked, for the first time in its nearly 900-year history, the conquest of the city by a foreign military force. What followed was a period of considerable destruction and looting, during which many churches, palaces, and libraries within the city were damaged, and a great many works of art, relics, and manuscripts that had been preserved within Constantinople for centuries were removed, some to be installed in churches and treasuries across Western Europe, where a number of these objects, including several bronze horses that came to adorn a basilica in Venice, remain to this day. Following the conquest, the Crusader leadership established a new state known as the Latin Empire, with a Western European nobleman placed on the throne in Constantinople, while the surrounding Byzantine territories were divided among various Crusader and Venetian lords. This arrangement, however, never achieved the stability or authority that the old Byzantine administration had once commanded. Several Byzantine successor states emerged in the aftermath of 1204. Most significantly, the Empire of Nicaea, established across the strait in western Anatolia under Byzantine aristocratic leadership, along with smaller Byzantine successor states in Epirus, in northwestern Greece, and Trebizond, along the Black Sea coast. Of these successor states, the Empire of Nicaea proved the most successful in preserving and eventually restoring Byzantine authority. Over the following decades, rulers based in Nicaea worked steadily to rebuild administrative and military structures, cultivate relationships with neighboring powers, and gradually reclaim Byzantine territory from the weakened Latin Empire and its allies. This effort culminated in the year 1261, when Byzantine forces under the general Alexios Strategopoulos, taking advantage of the Latin garrison's temporary absence from the city, managed to retake Constantinople with relatively little resistance, allowing the Nicene Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos to enter the city and restore Byzantine rule, founding what would become the final ruling dynasty of the empire, the House of Palaiologos. Yet the restored empire that Michael VIII inherited was, in almost every practical sense, a much diminished state compared to what had existed before 1204. Decades of foreign occupation, division, and warfare had severely damaged Constantinople's population, its economy, and its physical infrastructure. Many of the outlying territories that had once supported the empire economically and militarily had either been permanently lost to rival powers or existed only as loosely connected and increasingly independent holdings. The wealth and commercial dominance that Constantinople had once held within Mediterranean trade networks had, during this same period, shifted substantially toward the Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, both of whom retained significant trading privileges and commercial colonies within Byzantine territory, even after the restoration of Greek rule. It is worth pausing here to sit quietly with the weight of this period in the empire's history. The events of 1204 represented, in a very real sense, a wound from which the Byzantine state never fully recovered, even though it would continue to exist in a smaller and more precarious form for nearly 2 more centuries afterward. The restored empire under Michael VIII and his successors worked with considerable diplomatic skill to navigate an increasingly complicated political landscape, balancing relationships with the Italian maritime powers, various Balkan states, the remaining Crusader territories in Greece, and increasingly, a new and rising power emerging in Anatolia that would come to define the empire's final chapter. In our next segment, we will turn to this final period of Byzantine history, a time marked by continued diplomatic effort, cultural achievement, even amid hardship, and the slow, steady approach of a challenge that the empire would ultimately be unable to overcome. In the century and a half following the restoration of Byzantine rule in 1261, the empire governed from Constantinople settled into what many historians describe as a long twilight, a period during which the state's political and territorial position continued to narrow, even as its cultural and intellectual life, in certain respects, continued to produce work of considerable depth and lasting significance. The Paleologan dynasty, founded by Michael VIII, would continue to rule the empire for the remainder of its history, though the territory under its control shrank steadily across the 14th century. Internal conflicts among members of the imperial family, including a prolonged and damaging civil war during the 1340s between rival claimants to the throne, further weakened the state's ability to respond effectively to external pressures during a period when such pressures were mounting steadily along its remaining borders. Chief among these pressures was the gradual rise of the Ottoman Turks, a power that had emerged in northwestern Anatolia during the late 13th century and expanded steadily over the following decades, both at the expense of other Turkish principalities in the region and, increasingly, at the expense of Byzantine territory. By the middle of the 14th century, Ottoman forces had begun crossing into Europe as well, gradually establishing control over significant portions of the Balkan Peninsula, including territories that had once formed a core part of Byzantine authority in the region. Byzantine emperors during this period pursued a range of strategies to manage this increasingly difficult situation, alternating between diplomatic accommodation, strategic marriages, and periodic appeals to Western European powers for military assistance. One notable example of this diplomatic effort came during the reign of Manuel II Palaeologos, who personally traveled to Western Europe between 1399 and 1403, visiting the courts of France and England in an effort to secure support against the growing Ottoman threat, a journey that reflects both the seriousness of the empire's situation and the considerable personal effort its rulers were willing to invest in seeking outside assistance. These appeals to the West were complicated by the long history of religious division between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, and Western rulers, along with the papacy, frequently linked any substantial military assistance to the possibility of church union, a proposal that remained deeply controversial within Byzantine society, where many clergy and ordinary citizens viewed union with the Catholic Church as a betrayal of Orthodox tradition, regardless of the military benefits it might bring. This tension between practical necessity and religious conviction would continue to shape Byzantine diplomacy right up until the empire's final years. Despite these mounting external pressures, Constantinople during the 14th century continued to serve as a center of intellectual and artistic activity, producing scholars and artists whose work would leave a lasting mark well beyond the empire's shrinking borders. This period saw a renewed engagement with classical Greek philosophy and literature among Byzantine scholars, a scholarly movement that historians sometimes refer to as the Paleologan Renaissance, during which figures such as the philosopher Gemistus Plethon worked to preserve, study, and reinterpret ancient Greek philosophical texts, particularly those of Plato, at a level of depth that would soon prove enormously influential in Western Europe as well. Indeed, one of the more significant, if quiet, consequences of this final Byzantine intellectual flourishing involved the gradual movement of Greek scholars, manuscripts, and classical learning toward Italy during the 14th and 15th centuries, a movement that accelerated considerably as Byzantine territory continued to contract, and as some scholars sought safer and more prosperous circumstances abroad. Figures such as Manuel Chrysoloras, who taught Greek in Florence beginning in the 1390s, helped introduce a generation of Italian humanists to classical Greek texts that had, in many cases, been preserved primarily within Byzantine monastic and scholarly libraries throughout the preceding centuries. This transmission of classical learning is now widely recognized by historians as one of the important, though often underappreciated, contributions that the late Byzantine world made to the broader intellectual developments that would soon unfold across Western Europe during the Renaissance. Meanwhile, the territory actually governed from Constantinople continued to diminish. By the early 15th century, the empire consisted of little more than the city of Constantinople itself, along with a scattering of territories in the Peloponnese Peninsula of southern Greece and a few Aegean islands, surrounded almost entirely by Ottoman-controlled territory that had, by this point, expanded to encompass most of Anatolia and much of the Balkan Peninsula. The Ottoman state had, by this time, developed into a highly organized and militarily formidable power in its own right, governed by capable rulers and supported by an increasingly sophisticated administrative and military system. Byzantine emperors during these final decades, including John VIII Palaiologos, continued efforts toward securing Western support, culminating in his participation in the Council of Florence in 1439, where Byzantine and Catholic Church representatives formally agreed to a union of the two churches, an agreement intended in part to unlock more substantial Western military assistance against the Ottomans. This union, however, proved deeply unpopular among the Orthodox clergy and population back in Constantinople, and it was never fully accepted or implemented in practice. While the hoped-for scale of Western military support ultimately fell well short of what would have been needed to reverse the empire's declining fortunes. By the time John VIII died in 1448. The empire he left to his brother and successor, Constantine the 11th, consisted of little beyond the city of Constantinople itself and a few remaining territories in Greece, surrounded on all sides by an Ottoman state under the young and ambitious Sultan, Mehmed II, who had, from the earliest years of his reign, made clear his determination to bring the long history of Byzantine Constantinople to its conclusion. It is worth sitting with this image for a moment. A city that had, for over 1,000 years, stood as one of the great capitals of the world, now reduced to a single urban center, and its immediate surroundings, its emperor governing what remained with considerable dignity and diplomatic effort, even as the circumstances surrounding him grew increasingly difficult to manage. The scholars continued their studies, the churches continued their services, and the markets, smaller now than in centuries past, continued their quiet daily business. The rhythms of ordinary life persisting even as the broader political situation grew steadily more precarious. In our final segment, we will look at the events of 1453, the culmination of this long and gradual decline, and consider, calmly and without dramatization, what this moment meant both for the people who lived through it and for the broader history that followed in its wake. We come now to the final chapter of this long history, a chapter that unfolds across the early months of the year 1453, in the closing years of a state that had, by this point, endured in some form for well over 1,000 years, since Constantine first raised his new capital beside the waters of the Bosphorus. By this time, the Ottoman state had grown into one of the most powerful and well-organized military powers in the region, and its young sultan, Mehmed II, who had come to the throne in 1451 at the age of 19, had made the conquest of Constantinople a central goal of his early reign. Mehmed approached this goal with careful and methodical preparation, in a manner that echoes, in its own way, the patient planning that had shaped so much of this history from its very beginning. In the months before the siege began, Mehmed ordered the construction of a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, positioned at one of the narrowest points of the strait, allowing Ottoman forces to control the waterway and cut off any potential naval assistance that might otherwise reach Constantinople from the Black Sea. He also commissioned the casting of a number of very large cannons, designed specifically to breach the ancient Theodosian walls that had protected the city for so many centuries. Walls that had been built at a time before gunpowder weaponry existed, and that now faced, for the first time in their long history, an entirely new category of threat. The siege itself began in early April of 1453, with Ottoman forces, numbering considerably more than the defenders within the city, surrounding Constantinople by land, while Ottoman ships attempted, with mixed success, to blockade the harbor as well. Inside the city, the Emperor Constantine the 11th oversaw a defense mounted by a relatively small garrison, made up of Byzantine soldiers, along with a contingent of Genoese and other Western volunteers who had come to assist in the city's defense. Most notably a Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, who played a significant role in organizing the defense of the land walls throughout the weeks that followed. Over the following 7 weeks, the defenders managed, through considerable skill and determination, to hold the ancient walls against repeated Ottoman assaults, even as the new cannons gradually wore down sections of the fortifications that had stood for over 1,000 years. The defenders also famously stretched a great chain across the entrance to the Golden Horn, much as earlier generations had done in centuries past, successfully preventing Ottoman ships from entering the harbor directly, a defensive measure that forced Mehmed to undertake the remarkable engineering effort of transporting a portion of his fleet overland on rollers into the Golden Horn from a different direction entirely, bypassing the chain and placing additional pressure on the city's defenses from a new angle. By the final days of May, after weeks of continuous bombardment and repeated assaults, the Ottoman forces launched a final, large-scale attack in the early hours of the 29th of May. The exhausted defenders, spread thin across a long stretch of walls and reduced in numbers after weeks of fighting, were eventually overwhelmed at several points along the fortifications. Giovanni Giustiniani was seriously wounded during this final assault and was carried from the walls, a loss that further weakened the coordination of the defense at a critical moment. The Emperor Constantine the 11th, according to the historical accounts that survive, chose to remain and fight alongside his soldiers as Ottoman forces broke through the defenses, and he is generally believed to have died in the fighting that followed, though his body was never conclusively identified afterward, leaving his final moments to remain, to this day, a subject of both historical uncertainty and lasting legend among those who have told and retold this story in the centuries since. With the fall of the walls, Ottoman forces entered the city, and Constantinople, after a continuous history stretching back to its founding by Constantine over 1,100 years earlier, came under new rule. Mehmed II himself entered the city shortly afterward, and in the days and years that followed, he worked to transform Constantinople into the new capital of his own expanding Ottoman state, a role the city would go on to hold for centuries afterward, under the name that would eventually settle into common use: Istanbul. Hagia Sophia, the great domed church that Justinian had built 9 centuries before, was converted into a mosque shortly after the conquest, a role it would serve for approximately 500 years, before later becoming a museum in the 20th century, and in more recent years, returning once again to use as a mosque, a building whose long history across so many centuries mirrors, in its own quiet way, the layered history of the city that surrounds it. It is worth taking a moment, as we bring this long history to its close, to consider what this empire and this city represented across the many centuries we have traveled through together. Constantinople had served for over 1,000 years as a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval one, preserving Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology through centuries, when much of this knowledge might otherwise have been lost or scattered. Its scholars had copied and preserved ancient texts that would go on to shape the intellectual revival of Western Europe. Its architects had built structures whose engineering and beauty influenced builders across 3 continents. Its diplomats had carried its influence through marriage, religion, and trade into the developing states of Eastern Europe and beyond. And its ordinary people, generation after generation, had lived quiet lives within its walls, tending shops along the Meuse, praying beneath the mosaics of its churches, fishing in the waters of the Golden Horn, largely unaware that future historians would someday gather their long, layered history under a single name, Byzantine, and study it as one of the great, enduring civilizations of the medieval world. The empire that had begun with Constantine's careful selection of a small Greek city on a quiet strait had, over 11 centuries, weathered plagues, sieges, religious controversies, civil wars, and the loss and recovery of vast territories before finally, on that morning, in late May of 1453, coming to its conclusion. It is a long history, unhurried in its unfolding, much like the telling of it here tonight, and it closes now not with alarm or tragedy dwelt upon, but with a quiet respect for the sheer duration of what had been built, sustained, and eventually, gently, let go. Thank you for spending this time with the long, quiet history of Byzantium. Rest well.